Well, on behalf of the Melbourne School of Government and particularly Professor Helen Sullivan, the Director, who's sitting right in my line of fire here, welcome to this first, but hopefully not the last, Melbourne School of Government and ANZSOG, Australian and New Zealand School of Government event. The topic tonight is My Time in the White House, Reflections on Performance, Measurement and Management by Dr. Shelley Metzenbaum. Excuse me. I'm Professor Jenny Lewis and I'm the Strategic Advisor Research for the Melbourne School of Government and an ARC Future Fellow in Social and Political Sciences. I also have a very special interest in this particular topic tonight, which is why I'm doing the introductions. Before we launch off though, I do, as is customary at Melbourne, would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay respect to their elders and their families. I'd also like to thank ANZSOG very much for sponsoring Shelley's visit and for giving us the opportunity to co-host the event. Just a few words before I hand over. The School of Government, the Melbourne School of Government, was actually officially launched in June, mid-June. It's an interdisciplinary research and graduate teaching school which is working across 3 faculties: arts, business and economics, and law. We have 4 research themes emerging, the first one of which is governance and performance, which is why Shelley's topic is so apposite. Expertise and public policy, governing markets is another one, and risk, security and representation. So this talk obviously falls within the first of those, that's on governance and performance. And one aspect of this theme that we're hoping to build at the School of Government is around this issue of performance measurement. One way in which people are starting to talk about performance measurement and management over the last 10 years is about moving away from the kind of punitive approaches we've had and this kind of, dealing badly with people who don't hit the targets towards more quality-based approaches and concentrating on outcomes rather than outputs. There's been really much, very much a shift in the last decade in thinking about this, and fortunately I saw Shelley talking at the ANZSOG conference in Brisbane last week, and I think she was very much talking about this kind of new learning approach when discussing performance measurement. A couple of things I wrote down: outcome-focused stretch targets. Well, that was a good sign. But very much she was talking about the goal being not to just meet the targets, but to get progress. Not about sort of naming and shaming and punishing people who don't meet the performance set, but about transparency and feedback and learning from the process. So it's kind of, a shift to a focus on quality and outcomes rather than the kind of failure and outputs. So having said that, I'd like to just move on and welcome Dr. Shelley Metzenbaum. She's the founding president of the Volcker Alliance in the US. She's held several senior positions in federal and state government. Between 2009 and 2013, she served as Associate Director for Performance and Personnel Management at the White House Office of Management and Budget, and was responsible for setting and implementing the Obama administration's approach to improving the performance of federal programs. She's held several academic posts also, most recently as founding director of the Collins Center for Public Management at the University of Massachusetts, Boston's McCormack School. She also holds a PhD in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So tonight, Dr. Metzenbaum will reflect on the achievements and challenges of managing government performance from the White House. She will also discuss the broader agenda of improving performance and rebuilding trust in government in the US and globally. She's recognised as one of the US's leading experts in the field of public sector performance management and measurement, and it's my very great pleasure to hand over to her now, so please make her welcome.
Thanks very much, Jenny. I'm just delighted to be here today. It's great to be able to be, I didn't know this was the first, so I feel very lucky to be able to be one of your first talks at this exciting new engagement, and I've loved being part of this enterprise with ANZOG. It's been great to learn a little bit about what you're doing here that I can take back to the United States. So I thought I would start today by trying to talk to you about, first of all, a little bit more about who I am and why I had the job I had, but also what I'm trying to do right now. And then talk about what we did in the Obama administration to try and improve performance and why we took the approach we took. So for starters, let me just mention a few words about the Volcker Alliance. I don't know if any of you have heard of Paul Volcker in the United States. He's clearly one of the most respected men in the United States for his leadership at the Federal Reserve Bank and a number of other places. And he got to a stage in his life where he said, I'm fed up here. We need to rebuild confidence in government. We need to get more people working on making government more effective. And so he's decided to start the Volcker Alliance to try and do that. And so that's really what we're trying to do with the Volcker Alliance. And you'll notice we're called an alliance, and that's because we want to work in alliance with folks like you and across the world and across the United States, especially to figure out, to bring to government the best intelligence, focusing not just on the policy development, which is where so many of the best minds focus, but focusing on the policy execution. After you've written the laws, what about making them happen? And so that's really our focus, is on implementation. So let me talk a little bit now about my role and what we did at in the Obama administration to try and improve performance. So for starters, I was the Associate Director for Performance and Personnel Management. I reported to the Deputy Director for Management of the Office of Management and Budget, or also known as the Chief Performance Officer, because when Barack Obama named him, he decided that the Deputy Director for Management should be the Chief Performance Officer because this was about better performance. Part of the Deputy Director for Management's team, the Chief Performance Officer's team, is the Chief Information Officer or e-government office, the Chief Acquisition Officer, the Chief Financial Officer, and myself, Performance and Personnel Management. Together we made up the management team with the Chief Performance Officer, who reported to the Budget Director, who reported to the President. OMB is the leadership team for the President, trying to work with the agencies and make sure that the agencies' actions and their budget decisions and their implementation decisions really are aligned with the President's objectives. There are also policy councils that work with the President, and that is sort of the White House is the policy councils, Office of Management and Budget, also an Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. So I won't give you the whole White House overlay, but basically we really are sitting there trying to work on behalf of the President with all of the agencies to deliver on the President's objectives and to deliver more value for the public's dollar. So how do you do that? Well, I came in after having looked at what had been done in the past. I had actually been named to the job because I'd done a set of recommendations for the next administration on how to improve performance management. Those are available online if you want to look at it. But I'd looked at it, and what I had seen had happened. A law had been passed in 1993, Government Performance and Results Act. And that law said that every agency had to have a strategic plan, an annual plan, and an annual performance report. And in that strategic plan, you needed long-term goals, and in the annual plan, you needed short-term goals, the annual goals, and the annual performance report would report on how well they'd done. Well, what had happened over time was that you had started to get this sort of compliance attitude, which is folks felt like, I got to fill out the plans and reports. That's my job, filling out the plans and reports. And the prior administration had named performance improvement officers and said every agency needs to have one. And those performance shops became sort of the conduit for getting these mandated plans and reports done. But nobody was reading them. Nobody was using them. And so we really wanted to reset the mindset. We wanted to go from a compliance attitude to a performance improvement attitude. And we started talking about useful, useful, useful. We really wanted folks to use the goals and measures to to basically improve outcomes. And we needed to figure out how do you engage the folks at the top, but also across the organization in realizing that goals and measurement can be power tools, leadership tools for change. So we were trying to reset that mindset. So when I had looked at what had been happening in the last administration, there had been some progress made, but they had also seen some problems, and they decided they were going to do an assessment by program. So they broke the federal delivery system into like 1,000 programs, and OMB examiners would rate the program on how well it was doing. 25 questions, very good questions. But what had happened over time was, in addition to this compliance attitude, you had the folks in the agencies who were assigned to do this and to work on it, working with their programs to figure out how to get a good rating from the Office of Management and Budget, instead of trying to figure out how to improve performance. So we really, again, wanted to reset the mindset so that it would be useful. Useful, we talked about, right? And so that was really one of our big objectives. Now, if you're going to be useful, you got to figure out useful for whom? Useful for what? So we were pretty clear about the for what. We really wanted to improve outcomes, the things that the public really expects the government to deliver on. And we wanted agencies to be clear about what they were trying to accomplish. Useful for whom? Well, that's an interesting question about measurement. How do you actually think about who can use the measurement? Who's going to use the measurement? Are the managers going to use the measurement? You certainly hope that. But sometimes if you also have delivery partners you want to help with your measurement. You want to have the measurement help them, whether it's in the education field or the health field or the environmental water quality field. You really want them to try and figure out how to deliver more. And you wanted the data to get to them in a format that was actually going to be useful. So one of our objectives was useful, so you were improving performance, improving outcomes, but also improving return on investment, improving the quality. So once you figured out an effective practice, can you figure out a lower cost way to deliver that? Improve your cost effectiveness. But also, you ought to make sure that you're not having rude interactions with the public, making sure the quality of your transactions are good. And we had another objective too, which was to try and make sure that, to try and build public confidence in government and public understanding of government. So what did we do? Well, we looked around before taking office, and I had actually, before the Bush administration, I had been working on something at the Kennedy School called the Public Sector Performance Management Project. It was the executive session. We brought together leading thinkers, practitioners from the public and private sector to look at implementation of the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993. And when we looked at that, we came up with a set of recommendations, a small memorandum also available online, that basically said, set outcome-focused goals. And actually, don't set too many of them. Focus. Pick a few where you're going to really focus and set stretch targets. Now, stretch targets are really interesting because what stretch targets do, and this has been shown both in practice and in the laboratory, stretch targets do this very interesting thing, which is they energize people. If people feel that the stretch targets are realistic enough, they get very energized by them. But they also stimulate innovation. They get people to think in more creative ways, because if you've got a stretch target you need to reach, you can't keep doing business the way you've always done it. It gets you out of your rut. It forces you out of the rut of thinking and gets you to think, okay, how am I going to accomplish this much greater objective? So we were trying, it became clear that we really wanted folks to set stretch, outcome-focused targets, but not too many. We'd also learned over time, and this was even before the prior administration, that it was really important that the measurement be useful and it be fresh and it be frequent. So it needs to be timely. So how many of you have heard of New York City's CompStat? So it's short, we've got about 2 or 3 people in the room, it's short for computerized statistics. The police chief in New York many years ago, a guy named Bill Bratton, had said to come into the department, and he said, we need to reduce the crime rate. And we want to reduce it 25% in 3 years. Now, imagine that you're the police there. That's kind of a radical notion there. 25% crime rate reduction in 3 years feels like a very ambitious target, especially when you consider the fact that prior to that time, they'd actually not been trying to reduce the crime rate. Even though we all know the police, we think of the police as trying to reduce the crime rate, their key measure that they were using was response time. And that was important because people were thinking about, how the public perceives you and how you manage and getting good community relations. But Bratton came in and said response time is not really what we need here. We need to bring the crime rate down. And some of the police chiefs said to him, wait a minute, we're not responsible for the crime. And he said, we can influence the crime. Even though you cannot affect all the factors that go into and affect the crime rate, it is our job to bring the crime rate down. And then he asked, what is the crime rate? And it turned out that the crime data was collected every quarter. It was collected for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the United States, the federal level, reported to the state and then delivered. And it was due 6 months after the close of the quarter. So Bratton came in and he goes, what good is this? I've got 9-month-old data. What am I going to do with 9-month-old data? How does that help me figure out how to deal with the crime today? I need much more up-to-date data. So he asked folks to start to give him the crime data on a weekly basis, every Friday. And to give you a sense of the timing on this, people would deliver a floppy disk. You can remember that, some of you, and some of you have never seen one. And it went on to Lotus 123, right? They would put the data into Lotus 123. That's pre-Excel for those of you who don't know what Lotus 123 is. More than that, so he shifted to an outcome-focused target. He made it a stretch target, and he wanted much more timely data on a more frequent basis, and he wanted it from every every precinct. So it was both more frequent in terms of time and in terms of location. And he wanted the precinct captain to get up every 6 weeks or so at a CompStat meeting, that's short for computerized statistics, and stand up with a bunch of questioners in front of him, but also the bureau chiefs, the other people from the precinct, other precinct captains, perhaps the head of the detectives, the head of perhaps the general counsel, the head of budget, at a meeting where people at the table in front of the precinct captain had 2 screens behind him or her with all the data for the precincts on the crime rate, on the arrest rate, on crimes reported, also overtime rate. And Bratton wanted to hold them accountable for knowing the data in their precincts and trying to bring the crime rate down in the precinct. That's what he wanted them to be able to get up and talk about the data, have a data-driven discussion about the crime. So we had figured out that this was an important thing, and I had actually put this in this recommendations, compiling what some of the best minds had said, and it was fresh and frequent data, outcome-focused goals, and then use the data, make it actionable. Make sure that you're actually acting on it. And now it was almost 8 years later, and a group called the IBM Center for the Business of Government knocked on my door and said, would you be willing to write, it was about a year before the next election, would you write a new set of recommendations for the next administration? And I did that. And I looked at what else had been going on, and I had seen how folks had taken the CompStat model, and in New York City, they had actually applied it to the parks. They had a park stat, they had a corrections stat, where they were actually using this in other parts. There was a virtual virus because this way of managing was working. We had also seen how the city of Baltimore had started CityStat, and it had started to really make a difference by using the clear goals they started with, overtime rates. So a mayor has been able to use this. Governors were using this. This very simple concept. It's Management 101. And there's some basic building blocks here. Clear goals, measuring and analyzing performance, and data-driven discussions. And so those were some of the key recommendations that I had made in the recommendations. And they were the key recommendations that we put in place. I mentioned my set of recommendations because when you come into a White House job you come in, and I was named about the end of September, and I come in, and guess what? Everybody's running around pretty busy, right? We've got we are working on the Affordable Care Act legislation. We are still trying to stabilize, continue the progress we've made in stabilizing the economy, because that was clearly the president's first focus. And then we're also trying to get out of Iraq. We had AFPAC Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq issues. That's where a lot of the senior level attention was being directed. And I've come in, my boss has come in June. He finally gets confirmed by the Senate in June. He's never worked in the government before. And I come in, I've never worked with him before. He's hired me because when he looked around for people who knew how to do this performance work, I had written a set of recommendations which everyone seemed to like. So I took those set of recommendations as a blueprint for action. And so we had to figure out how to put it in place, how to make things happen. So the first thing that happened, unfortunately the recommendations had been written because I didn't come in until September, and a set of guidance went out to the agencies in June. So this is sort of the reality of managing in the kind of, in these kinds of transitions that you have, which is you're trying to get your team on board, but the team doesn't always come on board as soon as you actually need to make decisions. And you've got so many very intense decisions that you need to make that it was kind of helpful to have this blueprint for action that my recommendations became, and that you could use that. And the administration had sent out a guidance to all federal agencies, to the heads of the 24 largest federal agencies, essentially the 16 cabinet agencies and 8 other major agencies, and said a very simple thing. The head of the agency, the secretary, the cabinet member, needs to set about 5 stretch targets, outcome-focused goals. And they need to be targets that they can accomplish within 2 years. And they need to be accomplished within 2 years without new money and without new legislation. Now, why do you think we did it that way? Why do you think we said no new money, no new legislation, and 2 years? It's a 4-year term. Why didn't we make it 3 years? Why didn't we make it 4 years? The strategic plan was 4- and 5-year goals. Why do you think we made it 2-year goals? To implement. We really wanted to focus attention on implementation. And so by doing 2-year goals, this was really trying to get the attention to implementation. And so we also said, and this is going to be listed in the president's budget. In February, these will be put up as 2-year goals in the president's budget. And we also want you to figure out how you're going to measure progress on those goals. And once you figured out how to measure progress on those goals, we want the number 2 in every agency. And in the United States, those are political appointees at the head of the cabinet. The number 2 is the deputy secretary. You have assistant secretaries who are political appointees. We said the deputy secretary needs to run a quarterly data-driven discussion, a ComStat meeting, every quarter on the priority goals. And so agencies set about to establish their priority goals. After they got them set, we said, you need to do some action plans. We started to work with them. How are you going to implement? Because remember, as someone in the audience mentioned, this was about implementation. We wanted folks to think about, how are you going to get this done? How are you going to get this done? And so we asked agencies to set these goals and figure out how to get these done. And then, and by the way, what I'm showing you is performance.gov. This is a live site that we basically built along with the instructions we were sending agencies. It went live last December. But anyway, we said to agencies, you need to set clear goals, and agencies have all set clear performance targets, outcome-focused performance targets. We also have 14 cross-agency targets. We didn't set those initially in 2011. We set those for 2013. So we took initial steps, and then we continued to walk through. But if you basically look at these goals, you will see these are goals that the public, we hope, can understand, because we really wanted goals that the public could look at. Now, I have to say, if the first round of goal setting, and I'm opening up here the Department of Agriculture's goals. In the first round of goal setting, we only listed in the budget all of the priority goals. Agencies had strategic plans and annual plans, and you could see what they were. But we didn't list the full set of strategic goals and objectives as well as their annual goals. What we did in the second round, everybody said, well, what about everything else? You've told me to set these priority goals, but what about everything else? So in presenting this to the public for the first time, we decided we were going to present it as, you can see, the strategic goals, the strategic objectives, and the priority goals as it fits within the whole thing. But again, our emphasis here was on usefulness. So if you look here, you'll see on this enhancing rural prosperity, that's an objective that has a star, so it has a priority goal underneath it. And then you can click on the priority goal, and you can get more information about that priority goal by clicking on Learn More. Now, as you can see, this is not exactly meeting the best standards of website design, is it? You're going through layers and layers to find things. It's hardly that one-click standard. Is this, from your sense, a website that's really going to attract the public? Nah. Our objective, and think about users and usefulness, our objective in building this site was to actually communicate across government the new way of doing business. So remember I said we were trying to reset the mindset, to move folks away from thinking about this is about compliance with the reporting requirements and get them more to think about this is about using goals and measures to improve performance. And by getting them, and this site was just one tool of many tools. We had a performance improvement council made up of performance improvement officers where we were talking about this with them. How do we bring about change in practice in your agencies? So what I've taken you to now is what we call a priority goal homepage. And essentially, remember, every cabinet department and 8 other agencies had set priority goals, not very many. We set about 5. They went to about between 2 and 8. I think we had one at 9. We didn't fuss about the numbers. What we wanted was goals that the managers would really continue to pay attention to. And what you're looking at here is the Department of Interior's goal. And see Mike Poole there? Mike Poole is the goal leader. So remember the precinct captains who had to stand up and talk about their goals? One of the challenges in government is you can set all these goals and you can have measurements, but who's managing it? Well, we said you need to name goal leaders. The secretary or the deputy secretary had to name goal leaders. And then the goal leaders really have to report on a regular basis. But more than reporting, we wanted them to manage. So to do that, we didn't quite know how to do that. So I'm showing you some of the things of the ways we tried to do this. We asked all of them to describe why the goal was important. This is partly for public consumption, but partly for OMB's consumption, and partly to make sure the manager and his team and the people working on this goal understand, why did you pick this goal? Why is it important? And they can also put as many Learn More buttons in there as they wanted to provide more information. In addition, we wanted folks to explain what strategies you used and why you picked the strategies. So if you're in the education field or the healthcare field, there may be a lot of evidence or evaluations behind strategies you chose. We wanted agencies to be able to explain to the public, to their own people, some of the other users, the people in their organizations, why they picked the strategies they picked. Now, in this case, let me, going back up here, you basically see the tabs we have. Again, we're trying to get the goal leaders to really take ownership here. So we also said you have to, every quarter, do a quarterly progress update. A quarterly progress update that looks at the progress from the time the goal was set and also in the most recent quarter. And if you've made progress, describe it. If you are not making progress, describe why you haven't made progress, and then describe what you plan to do about it. So every goal, there's a progress update, there's next steps, which is what you hope to accomplish in the current quarter and the next quarter, and then there's also future actions is what you hope to accomplish for the duration of the goal period. Again, trying to change this from a reporting, which even though you're seeing this, this is a way of managing. We were trying to change the way agencies were managing. And in the case of the Department of Interior, they decided they were going to take advantage of the opportunity to explain more, and so they lay out their strategies in the Learn More buttons with a bunch of links. So here you can see the various strategies and learn more about the various strategies. Moreover, on their milestones, you can see in the milestone section, they didn't lay out things like we're going to do a request for proposal next quarter or we're going to award grants next quarter. They had gotten an ongoing rhythm going, and so they actually wanted to show more detail. This tells you about each of the projects what the status was. So it's a way of communicating across their organization to the people who were applying for permits, because their goal was reflecting the president's objective of more renewable energy, less energy dependence on oil. The goal was to get 9,000 megawatts of renewable energy permitted within 2 years, and permitted on or crossing interior land, because the Department of the Interior realized one of the assets it had is a lot of land. So it wanted to use that land to really deliver on this presidential objective that the president had talked about during his campaign, during his State of the Union, to deliver on it. They had come up with this goal, renewable energy, more renewable energy permitted on interior land, and they set a goal 9,000 megawatts by the end of 2011, September 30th, 2011. And then they started working on all these projects. Well, so this tells you here which projects are active, which ones had actually gotten permitted. But what's interesting, if you think about this, when I go back, if I look at the indicators for the Department of Energy, remember I said the goal was 9,000 megawatts. You can see it right there. That it now is 11,000 megawatts for 13, but 9,000 megawatts by the end of September 30th, 2011. Well, let me roll down for a second here and take you to the end of September 2011. The Department of the Interior only got 6,054 megawatts permitted. Is that a problem? What should OMB have done when they only got to 6,000 megawatts? The goal was 9,000 megawatts. Did they make their target? Didn't make their target. So we had to make a decision. Is this a problem or not? And we actually decided, look at that. Look how much progress they've made starting up. They clearly were having trouble starting up. Those problems were because they were trying to figure out how to permit renewable energy on interior land without compromising the environment. How to do effective environmental reviews that allowed you to move forward with renewable energy without compromising another goal, which is improving the environment. So it took them a while to figure it out. You can see it just by looking at this trend line, right? So by the end of September 2011, they only got to 6,000. And what did we do? We decided to use this as a poster child for the fact that sometimes we're not going to penalize you if you don't meet all your targets. Because you were making significant progress here, you had obviously figured out the problems and you were starting to make real progress. And, obviously we were talking to Interior to try and figure out what was going on, but it was clear they had had problems, they worked those problems through, they were making real progress. The goal is not to figure out how many targets you meet. The goal is to improve, to make progress in the areas where you're trying to make significant progress. You hope to meet the targets. Targets are a really powerful tool. They're a really powerful mechanism, a great shorthand for communicating with the public, with your own organization, with your delivery partners if you depend upon other levels of government, contractors, grantees. Targets are a fabulous focusing tool, but meeting the target isn't the objective. The target is a means to an end, which is improving performance. Now take a look at where Interior is now. It is at the end of March 2013, they'd hit 12,500 megawatts. Their goal was 11,000 megawatts by the end of 2013, September. And lo and behold, they've beat their target here. And because this remains a very important priority, The president has actually said in his climate change remarks, he actually set an even more stretch target for them. So they're charging on. They figured out how to do this, and they're going to continue working to make more progress. So this was the way we were trying to do business, with the goal being useful on specific objectives, improving performance, figuring out lower cost ways to deliver, making sure you had good quality interactions, and in the process also starting to explain to the public what it is you're trying to accomplish and why, how you're trying to make progress, and why you're using that strategy. And then as you make progress along the way, how things are going. Now, one of the things we learned along the way, or decided along the way, we had originally laid out these graphs when we had an internal version of this site. We had laid out the graphs so that we had a target line for every quarter. You can see here, if you click on data and explanations, you actually can see the quarterly targets. But when we had a quarterly target line, everybody got so caught up in getting the quarterly targets right and figuring out did you make the right decisions this quarter. And sometimes you can't quite manage that way. It takes a little more time. Something happens in one quarter that you can adjust in the next quarter. So we have it so that agencies, actually, we want them to think about it, and they can provide explanations, as you see here, for quarter to quarter, what happened in each quarter. But we eliminated the target line from the graph at the same time that the graph can be seen with the target on the same web page. So we want folks really driving for that target, but we didn't want to get them overly focused, especially on the quarter-to-quarter targets. It's one of those things we learned in the first 2 years of operations, that too many conversations were going back and forth about the quarterly targets, when in fact we wanted the strategy to be right. And we wanted to allow agencies to adjust their actions along the way. We wanted Mike Poole to sit back and say, what's going on? Why? How am I doing that? So let me go back to show you a little bit here in terms of, it wasn't always one agency managing a goal. You saw at the beginning we had cross-agency goals. A goal that's shared by multiple organizations is a powerful way to get folks to coordinate across organizational silos or stovepipes. So we have the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Veterans Administration decided that they were going to work together on a shared goal of reducing veterans' homelessness to get it down to 0 by the end of 2015, but they also had 2-year reports. We didn't let them, if they had a 2015 goal of 0 homelessness for veterans, we wanted to know, what do you hope to get it to in 2011? What do you hope to get it to in 2013? And HUD basically started having these quarterly meetings and decided to invite the Veterans Administration to join in these quarterly meetings, which they called HUD-STAT meetings. Now remember I talked a little bit before about CompStat meetings, the computerized statistics? So one of the questions that we thought about when we started our efforts was, should we call everything STAT? Should we tell agencies we want them all to run STAT meetings? And we decided we weren't going to prescribe STAT meetings. We were going to prescribe data-driven reviews. Remember, goals, frequent measurement, and data-driven reviews on a regular basis, on a frequent basis. But we didn't call them STAT. And we did that because we know from looking in the past, you get somebody, one administration comes in and mandates a practice and gives it a name. And the next administration comes in and says, oh, we're not going to do that. We're going to give something our own brand. And so it was actually a little problematic that we didn't brand this. We didn't give it a simple name because basically there was no handle that people could grab onto. At the same time, we were using some very basic, Management 101 practices, but that weren't happening enough, which was getting agencies to be very clear about what it was they were trying to accomplish and doing that in the form of a goal. And then running these data-driven meetings. HUD, as you can see, started to have it laid out here, and I urge you all to take a look at this if you want to learn more about what HUD-STAT is and what it isn't. They decided to have STAT meetings, and they used the data, they used the evidence, and they asked smart questions. What do you use the data for? Well, one is to figure out where to focus. It's sometimes hard to do it all, so you need to figure out where to focus. So if HUD was trying to deal with eliminating homeless veterans, you first have to say, where are the veterans? Where are the homeless veterans? Because veterans were not returning to the places that they had departed the United States. They were coming back to different communities. California turns out to be one of the communities with a lot of veterans. So one of the things HUD was trying to do was to figure out, where should we focus? And they decided California is one place to focus, but also we can look across the whole federal government at the same time, and they looked at their regional data. Now, what you're looking at here are bar charts showing voucher utilization rates. Remember what I talked about in terms of the beauty of a goal, of a clear outcome-focused goal, is that it lets the organization be more agile in the approaches they take to solving the problems. What HUD had as a tool at its disposal was vouchers. Vouchers that could be used to pay for rent. And so they used these vouchers to be paid for rent. Now they looked at their data and they noticed, wait a minute, people are not using all the vouchers we put out. Why wouldn't a veteran use the voucher to help pay for their rent? Why don't we have 100% utilization rates? And why does it vary by region? So they started asking the questions. So they used the data to help them set priorities, but they also used the data to trigger focused follow-up questions. Very complicated focused follow-up questions. Why? Right? Why don't we see this 100% utilization rates? Well, how do you get the answers to that? It depends upon who you bring into the data-driven discussions. So they figured we better call the local offices, get them on the phone. So they had some phone calls with the Los Angeles office, with some of the others, and said, what's going on? Why aren't you using your vouchers? And the answer they got back is, one of the reasons is that the vouchers, that the rent requires a security deposit, and they can't use the vouchers for security deposits. So then HUD went back and looked and got its general counsel to look to say, can we use our vouchers for security deposits? And they looked at the laws and said, no, these are for rental payments. They're not for security deposits. But then the VA said, we have money that we can use for the security deposits. And so the two agencies working together were able to come up with solutions in real time. They didn't have to wait for another budget cycle to say, we're proposing to get security deposit funding. And they started to realize they needed the Department of Defense at the table and a lot of the local organizations. There are now rapid response teams that are going on in communities across America with trying to figure out how they're going to reduce veterans' homelessness and then sharing their success and failure stories with one another. They're learning from each other's experience. So that's what we were trying to do. Here, HUD is mapping where the veterans are who need the vouchers and where the vouchers are actually available. And realizing that there was a mismatch between where they were allocating the vouchers to, and so they needed to be able to more nimbly move the vouchers to where the veterans needed to use the vouchers. And what you can start to see is, and this is a great graph, I love it, it's a trend graph. It's not a controlled study, but what HUD has done here is they put a vertical line where they've taken specific actions so that you can look and everybody else can look with them to see what's happening and did the actions they're taking make a difference. So again, what we were trying to do was reset the mindset so that agencies were thinking about goals and measurement as power tools that help them manage smarter and that help them communicate across their organization and enlist and engage others in helping solve the problems that the agencies had taken on. Let me take you to another agency, another goal within the Department of the Interior, reducing violent crime on Indian reservations. Now, this crime for 2011 was basically to bring the crime rate down 5% on 4 Indian reservations within 2 years. Does that sound like a stretch target to you? Yes, says some, no, says some. For those who say yes, why does it sound like a stretch target? Because 5% is enormous change. If you don't know how to bring the crime rate down, then 5% is significant, even if it's only on 4 reservations. So consider here how you might have framed this goal. They could have said we're going to bring it 5% down, 5% across all tribes, across all Indian reservations. We're going to bring the crime rate down 5% across all Indian reservations. And how, as a manager, you would think about managing that? You would come up with mega solutions, right? That would be, let's try and figure it out and hope that it works. But you'd have to sort of do a one-size-fits-all, or you'd have to send the same directive down to everybody and hope they make it work. They said we're going to focus on 4 reservations and figure out if we can figure out how to bring the crime rate down, the violent crime rate down. So by saying 4 reservations, they really had, it was Indian communities. By saying 4 tribal communities, they were really saying, wait a minute, what we're going to do is focus and figure out an effective practice first. And so this is what they did. And the first thing they did was they realized they had to make sure the tribal police were trained, and they had to get them engaged in discussions about how to bring the crime rate down. But they also had to figure out how to count the crime rate. So they brought a bunch of folks from these 4 tribes to Washington, to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to try and figure out, to train them in how to use the Uniform Crime Code and reporting system. And while they were in Washington, those guys who were getting trained realized they weren't in training all the time. They started to use that time to brainstorm with each other, how do we bring the crime rate down? So they were starting to own this, these folks who were getting trained in this. They also built a data system that the local tribe could use. And so they started to look at this, and they started to look at the crime stats every week. The Bureau of Indian Affairs started to have weekly calls with each of the tribes. And you saw very different things happen in different tribes. You saw local community groups, tribal leaders starting to take this on in different ways. By the end of 2 years, the crime rate had gone down 35% on those 4 reservations after not knowing how to bring the violent crime rate down at all. But it had only gone down in 3 of the 4 reservations. And so basically, this time to set goals again, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs said, look, we're going to keep working with these 4 reservations and try and bring the crime rate down another 5%. Even though we got it down 35%, that was amazing. We never believed it, but we're not going to bite off such a stretched target that we're going to get overwhelmed by the ambitiousness of it. We're going to try and bring it down 5% in those 4 reservations and add 2 more reservations. After 3 years, the crime rate's gone down 55% on the first 4 reservations, the violent crime rate, on all 4 of them. But on the 2 new reservations, they're having trouble. They're trying to figure out the crime rate is going up. They don't know if it's because people are reporting more, which is possibly what happened on that first reservation where they were having the problem, but they're trying to figure that out. And Kevin Washburn, that's what he thinks about every day. He knows he's responsible for this, and he's trying to figure that out. So what did we learn? Goals, measurement, analysis of the data. Analysis for what? To trigger the focused follow-up questions, to find what looks like promising practices, to see if you want to replicate them in other places. And data-driven discussions that aren't gotcha discussions, but are how do we improve discussions? What's working? What's not working? So if you actually look here, the Bureau of Indian Affairs decided, look, we can't work. We're not going to work intensively with all of our tribal communities, but we want to basically share what we've learned with other communities. And so they've built a handbook that basically lets you see what's happening and she sees month over month, for the same reservation, same time in the year, so they can see if there are patterns or not, and engage others in asking questions and share the learning. So that's the progress we've made. You can look and see on the 117 goals, fairly significant progress has been made on all of the goals. There are some where they're having trouble, but you can figure out where they're having trouble and what they're doing. To quote Bill Bratton, Bratton said, nobody got in trouble if the crime rate went up. They got in trouble if they didn't know why it had gone up and they didn't have a plan to deal with it. That's what he said to the precinct captains. Those are the accountability expectations we placed on federal goal leaders and that we placed on the deputy secretaries and the secretaries. And that's moving forward as we go. I should say this has been made, the practices we recommended and put into practice and tried, Congress has now put into law, and so agencies will continue to do this. There are some areas where I think we have lots of learning to do. I mean, because we learned from the past and we found these power tools really work, but there are areas where we really need some work still to be done. One is, how do you use goals and measurement to communicate? If we had done a chart that showed trends across all of the data for everything and didn't have some of that narrative description of how and why, how do you think people would have looked at it? They would have gone first, I suspect, to the areas where there were problems and focused on the problems. We want to be able to find the problems and to focus on them, but also to find the successes and spread the successes. So figuring out how do you communicate this information, I think, is a challenge. And it's not always on a website, but how do you do that? That's part of the implementation we need to understand better, the theory of transparency, if you will. Figuring out how to learn from experience. How do you integrate evidence, evaluations, and other kinds of evidence into agency operations, not as separate enterprises, but integrating them so the program managers can actually use that information. And then finally, figuring out how to use incentives with goals and measures. So basically, do you penalize people if they don't meet their targets? As I've said, we don't think that's the right approach to take. At the same time, you want some threat on them. You really want them paying attention. How do you structure incentives? Probably not pay for performance systems for individuals, but perhaps pay for performance with grants and contracts. If you have effective monitoring systems that prevent measurement manipulation. But if you do link people to targets that they have to make in order to get their pay, you're going to have them pick timid targets. And we wanted the stretch targets so that they knew they would make progress. And we basically said in our guidance, if agencies make all of their stretch targets all of the time, OMB will come looking to see if you've had set sufficiently ambitious targets. That was our way of saying, we want stretch targets, we want you to try and meet them, but we don't expect you to meet all of them all the time, and it's not a problem if you don't. So that's where we are. That's where I left it a few months ago, and it's continuing with agencies also now working on setting new strategic goals and annual performance goals, as well as a new round of FY15 priority goals. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your time, and I think take some questions. Is that right? Yeah. Thank you very much.